I grew up on a boat. My dad was a same boat operator when I was a kid. He had a gillnetter for a couple of years, went back seining. I started seining as a 13-year-old with my dad, and then as a 14-year-old with some other relatives. And commercial fishing is just part of my identity. It's part of who I am. And going gill netting now is my way of staying connected to my past, but also having fun. I enjoy it. It's one of my happy places. And I stopped commercial fishing in 2007. And then it's 15 years later or so. Yeah, 15 years later. And I'm still fishing. So I enjoy that part. It just means I can have a family connection. I can have a occupational connection. I can just go out and have fun. I was probably like somewhere between 5 and 8 years old. I don't really remember it, but I'd be on the top deck of my dad's boat, and then the crew would be down on the deck doing whatever, or relaxing between sets, and I'd yell down to them, "Hurry up, you guys, highball," or something like that. And they'd look around, and even back then my voice sounded like my dad's, so they thought my dad was telling them to do something. And it was me, and they'd look up and see it was me, and they'd curse me and chase me around, and I'd interrupt their nap or something, like while they were waiting for a set. But that was the first kind of knowledge of what I was doing on the boat. I would have been around 12, and my dad had a gill netter at the time, and we were fishing in the Deepwater Bay area, Campbell River, but we also were fishing in the Fraser. We were fishing day on and day off, and we were tied up in Granville Island every night. And so for that summer, I was my dad's deckhand, gill netting down there in August and July up in Johnson Straits, in the lower end of Johnson Straits. And at the next year, my dad got an offer to run a seine boat, and I went out. I wasn't crew, like my dad inherited the crew in the boat. Somebody needed to be replaced, and so my dad filled in. And I went out, and this was back in the days when the skiff was powered by oars, not by outboard motors like it is now. And really old school, right? Wooden skiffs with oars. And the skiff man they had just wasn't up to par. And my dad told me to swap out with him, and I started working like the last 3 weeks of August for my dad, because the adult person couldn't do as good a job as the 13-year-old. And then at 14, my dad went back crewing, and I jumped on one of the other relatives' boats from Cape Mudge, and that launched my 20-some-odd year career as a commercial fisherman. I've heard of stories from some of the relatives or, especially the old timers in the village who gillneted by hand. And nowadays, everybody gillnets on a modern boat that's bigger, like usually 30 feet or more, with hydraulic equipment and a drum. I'm out there in a 15-foot speedboat with an outboard motor and a gillnet that I pull in by hand. As far as I know, I'm the only one that does it in this area, whether it's here off Comox or up in Campbell River, Quadra Island. I haven't seen anybody do this, and definitely not anybody doing this in the weather that I've done it. I probably half the time I'm out there, whether it's October or August, it's usually a small craft morning, and I shouldn't be out there, but I am. I probably was a kid and knowing that my dad was telling stories about his family and his father. So my father's dad, to my grandfather, his name is Frank Assu. My grandfather was 18 years old approximately. He was gillnetting by hand on the Fraser River in a rowboat that also had a sail. And the boat was a Columbia River style boat, so down in the US, like Columbia River that's in between Washington State and Oregon State. They had this design, and the design of these boats made its way up to Canada, and he was operating this at 18 years old. It was probably in the last 10 or 12 years, off and on, we've talked about it, that my grandfather was doing gillneting by hand, and now I'm doing gillneting by hand. I started off gillneting with my father on his more modern boat with a drum and mechanical stuff, and graduated from that into wooden seine boats, into fancy aluminum seine boats, and now I'm into kind of not regressing, but retracing history and going back to doing it by hand. It's a more traditional way of doing things. And I think it's more sustainable. I'm not polluting as much. My environmental footprint is a lot smaller than a bigger boat, even a gillnetter. I guess it was really special to know that, I never met my grandfather. He died when he was 50, and he's died in 1958. I was born in 73. So there's a big gap between that. I only knew my grandmother. To have that connection of knowing not only am I named after my grandfather, but I'm doing the same type of work that he's done in his life makes it pretty special. Just a knife that we use for making gawas, and gawas is basically fish jerky. This was my grandmother's knife, and it was passed down to me by my father probably 25 or so years ago. I started taking over like the fishing duties for my family. So even when I was still living with my parents as, late teens, early 20s, I started to do the fishing. My dad was starting to get out and start to retire. So I built my first smokehouse on their property, and, I was still fishing. So I was bringing back all the salmon and stuff. And so they gave me this knife. My mom probably used it more than my dad. And then I started to get into it, and I haven't used it in a few years. So it's now just a piece of my grandma. I don't know how old it is. I'm guessing it's probably close to 100 years old. Maybe my grandfather made it. Could be, I don't know. But it's one of the last few things that I can physically touch that I know my grandma touched. So my family traditionally smokes chum, and that's what I've been taught as culturally our village's main primary source of food was the chum salmon, and what we smoked quite a bit. And one of the reasons for it is it was more accessible. We had pinks and springs and cohos are going up the Campbell River, and chums will be going by. But the chum is a fairly big salmon species. It's probably, in abundance wise, it's not as much as sockeye or pinks in volume, but they're definitely bigger than both of those. And not as big as a spring or coho can get fairly big, but there's not as many of those. So even traditionally, like 100 years ago, there's chum were more prevalent. So they became what I was brought up to be told in our village was chum was the one that we traditionally smoked, and it was thicker, and so we could take off the gallus from those chum, and then we would be left with a more uniform fillet, and that would be what we use for our main meals for smoking, and the gallus is our snacks out of that. So. So when I stopped fishing on the same boats, I lost access to food fishing. And I lost access to that ability to get salmon. And I wanted to be reliant on myself. I didn't want to be dependent on other people. And so getting a boat this size was more about convenience, but also money. Like I didn't have the money to buy a gill netter of my own. I didn't have the money to buy a full-size net and pay for the fuel and the upkeep. I was able to scrape together the amount of money to buy this boat and motor and a trailer and, outfit the little gill net I have, or gill nets I have. But over time, I wasn't spending all this at once. And even if you add it all up, it's not a lot of money in the grand scheme of things of a commercial setup. But if I go out there for a day on my boat, I might burn a half a tank of fuel, which is, 10 liters of gas. And, it's pretty economical. And, I can just drive up from my house. It takes me about an hour and a half to get to the boat ramp, another, half hour to get unloaded and jet over to Quadra Island. It's pretty easy for me to get out there. And I'm not paying for moorage. I'm not paying for all these expenses. Most people who are doing gill netting now, that they're for food fishing anyway, they're doing it when they're not commercial fishing of some kind. So their fees are taken care of by their commercial costs and stuff. And whereas I don't have that to offset my own thing. So this is an economical way for me to stay connected to the fishing industry. I only have a net that's 50 fathoms long. It's only 25% of a typical commercial gill net length. So I need to have space where I know I'll have better success. First thing I do is I check for where the current is going. So I usually fish in 3 spots. One at the very end of the point, one kind of a quarter of the way in, and then the one I go to that's almost all the way into the bay. And I'll go find the kelp and I'll look for which direction the kelp's moving. That tells me which way the current is flowing. So that gives me an indication of how I set the net. So if I don't set it in the proper way, then the net will drift on itself in a way that won't be as productive. So because my net's so short, I also need to be placed almost perfect going out. So I usually wanted to have in a kind of a half moon shape thing. Going straight across is not as successful. Some people will have like S's and curves in their nets, but that's the big guys on the the gillineters with the long nets. But for me, it's more important, I think, because I only have a limited amount of time with my little net to catch them, right? So that's the first thing I do, is just go to the kelp. Being in the commercial fish industry, I was always able to get my own fish. And when I left, I didn't want to be dependent on, somebody else providing for me. For me, it was not really pride. It was more of, I wanted to do it on my own. And I also didn't want to stand on the dock waiting in lineups. Not that joining a line is anything wrong with it, because there's hardly any fishermen out there. So lines are going to be expected nowadays. And the way things have gone, there's no more lines now. Like the Adelaide Fisheries Commission, they go and deliver fish now to elders at least, and to the non-elders, they say, here's where you can pick up your fish. And it's almost like a quota system now for our people, whereas in the past, there wasn't a limit on how much we can get. For me, I wanted to be able to be self-sustaining and independent as well. And doing it this way offers me that ability to be independent still, and the ability to go and connect to what I used to do a couple times a year. So for me, it's more about enjoying while I'm out there, and then also being able to provide for myself while enjoying it. I really couldn't have done this without so many other people, whether it's my dad's and the experience that I've had, him helping build one of my nets, or people like Tim who, conversations and providing me equipment and the ability to build a net. That's just getting ready to do that. And then when I'm out there, I was never alone. There's been days where I'm fishing alone, but there's always somebody from my village who's been out there fishing, whether it's on the same boat, or my cousin who's running the test fishing boat for DFO on the same boat, or other gillnetters. They're always around, and they're always happy to chat. They're always happy to, check me out, because some of them haven't seen me in a few years, because I've been, it's been 20 some odd years since I moved away from my village. And that might have been the first time they see me. So they're curious. What are you doing out here in this little boat? So it's an opportunity to catch up and chat. And then, they're giving me tips. So you should try over here, or you should go into the bay a little more. And all these people have influenced how I've fished over the last 15 or 16 years. And I really couldn't be here without them, or the people that come with me. It's not just me going out here. I just happen to own the equipment, but it's bigger than that. Like I've turned my small family and my extended friends and stuff into a bigger circle that has enabled me to be where I am today.